The maps had been wrong since before dawn. I had been standing at the table for nearly 2 hours, my single eye moving across the topographic charts spread over the wooden desks, and I understood with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent 40 years in uniform that what the map showed and what existed on the ground were no longer the same thing. The red marks, the blue marks, the arrows and the lines and the careful notations made by my operations staff in the small hours of the morning. They were precise, they were professional, and they corresponded to a reality that had already dissolved somewhere out there in the Ukrainian darkness. February 1943. The school had been abandoned before we arrived, its windows blown out by some earlier violence, its walls blackened by a fire that no one had bothered to explain. We had set up the command post in the main hall, when the field stoves pushed into the center of the room because the walls offered nothing against the cold that pressed in from every direction. The stoves barely kept the maps from freezing. They did nothing for the men who had to read them. Outside, the Ukrainian steppe was a white sheet that merged with a sky of the same color. No horizon, no depth. The snow had erased everything: roads, villages, front lines. It had even erased the war until you got close enough to hear it. I was 62 years old. I had lost my right eye during Barbarossa, a piece of shrapnel near Yelnya in October of 1941, and the patch had become so much a part of my face that I sometimes forgot there was anything missing beneath it. My vision had adapted, as the body adapts to everything when it has no alternative. But standing in that schoolroom in the gray light before dawn, studying figures that did not add up to anything survivable, I was aware of the limitation in a way I rarely allowed myself to be. 20,000 men. That was the number I kept returning to. 20,000 men assigned to the SS Panzer Corps under my command, spread across a front that demanded 3 times that number to hold with any confidence. Against them, the Soviet 3rd Tank Army under General Alexei Volkov, 3 armored corps, 4 rifle divisions, armored reserves we had not yet fully identified. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was not subtle. It was the kind of mathematics that a competent junior officer could calculate on the back of an envelope in 10 minutes. I had been calculating it for days, and it kept producing the same answer. An answer that the orders coming down the chain of command were not prepared to accept. That gap between what the numbers said and what the orders required was what kept me awake. Not the cold, not the guns. The gap. The field telephone rang twice before my aide answered it. He spoke briefly, listened, then carried the handset across the room without expression. That absence of expression told me more than whatever was in the message. Another position lost. Another gap in a line that was already more gap than line. I set the handset down and returned to the maps. The stoves crackled. Outside, somewhere to the east, artillery spoke in the low rumbling language it used before dawn. Not an assault, not yet. It's just the constant reminder that the war had not gone to sleep even if the men briefly had. I had not slept. This was not unusual. In the preceding weeks, sleep had become something I managed in intervals. 2 hours here, 90 minutes there. Enough to keep the mind functioning, but not enough to make the exhaustion disappear. It had simply become part of the background of everything, like the cold, like the distant guns. They like the maps that refused to match the reality they were supposed to represent. What kept me awake was not the cold, though the cold was severe, 30 degrees below zero on the worst nights, enough to freeze engine oil and the water in canteens. It was not the artillery which had become so constant a presence that I barely registered it anymore. It was something more precise than either of those things. It was the growing certainty that the orders coming down the chain of command in the days ahead would be impossible to execute, and that I would have to decide what to do with that impossibility. The first warning had come 9 days earlier, and it had not come from the enemy. Colonel Ernst Falk had been commanding the Das Schwert Division since the autumn. He, a capable and methodical officer whom I had known since the early training days, when I had helped form the kind of men who now commanded these formations. He was competent in the way that the best staff-trained officers are competent. Thorough, reliable, not brilliant, but solid in the way that reliability often matters more than brilliance in a sustained campaign. On the afternoon of February 9th, Falk stopped responding to radio communications. It was not dramatic. And there was no final transmission, no sudden interruption. The responses simply began arriving with greater delay, then with less coherence, and finally stopped arriving altogether. My signals officer informed me at 1800 hours that Das Schwert's command post was not answering on any frequency. The landlines had been cut. They were cut every few hours by Soviet fire, but the radio should have been working. When the explanation arrived 2 hours later through a liaison officer who drove from the Das Schwert position in a half-track that had lost one of its tracks somewhere on the road and arrived listing badly to one side, he delivered the message with the particular blankness of a man who has been told exactly what to say and nothing more. Colonel Falk had been evacuated. Exhaustion, they said. I looked at the liaison officer for a moment after he delivered this. He met my gaze and then looked at a point slightly past my left shoulder, which told me he understood what the word exhaustion meant in this context and preferred not to be asked about it directly. I did not ask. War has its own vocabulary for the things it does not want to name. Exhaustion was the word the Army used when what had actually happened was that a man's mind had finally reached the place where it could not carry the weight any further. Not cowardice. Not weakness in any simple sense. The accumulated mass of weeks and months of continuous combat, of decisions made under impossible conditions, of losses absorbed and absorbed again until the capacity for absorption ran out. I understood this. I had watched it happen to officers I respected throughout 4 years of this war, and in the previous one. What I did not say to anyone that evening, what I would not have said even to my closest staff officer, was the thought that moved through me in the minutes after the liaison officer left. Not whether Falk would recover, not what his breakdown meant for the operational situation, though that was urgent and required immediate attention. What I thought, alone in the map room in the growing dark, was whether the line was somewhere ahead of me as well. At 62, here with one eye and 40 years of accumulated weight of my own, standing on the edge of what promised to be the worst weeks of a war that had already produced weeks I would not have believed possible. I allowed myself 10 seconds to consider that question. Then I closed the door on it. A commander cannot afford to look at that particular threshold for long. The moment you begin to calculate your own limits, you have already begun to approach them. Colonel Otto Reimer assumed command of Das Schwert on the morning of February 10th. He did so without ceremony, without speeches, with the quiet efficiency of a man who understands that the situation allows no slow transitions. His first communication to my command post was a brief dispatch acknowledging the change of command, followed immediately by a situation report that Falk had apparently not been able to draft for the preceding 48 hours. The report was precise, it was bleak, and it confirmed everything the maps had been suggesting, but not quite saying. The man who told me the truth most plainly was Werner Haas. General Werner Haas commanded the Leibgard Division, the most experienced formation in the Corps, and he was unlike any division commander I had encountered in 4 decades of service. He had no general staff training. He did not think in broad operational terms. He had never been to the war colleges that produced the methodical, systematic officers who populated the upper ranks. He had risen through sheer force of character and what I can only describe as a physical understanding of combat, an instinct for what was happening on the ground that no amount of academic study could replicate. When I met with him at his forward command post on February 11th, a half-destroyed farmhouse near the Donets, where his staff had spread maps across a kitchen table that still had a child's drawing pinned to the wall above it, he explained the situation with the frankness that bordered, in another man, on insubordination. He told me the front did not exist. Not in the sense of a formed defensive line, not even in the sense of a series of connected positions. What existed, he said, were resistance points, islands, small groups of men in villages and farmhouses and the occasional elevated position, separated from each other by kilometers of open ground through which the Soviets moved freely, especially at night. His grenadiers had not slept a full night in 3 weeks. They held what they held by will and by the fact that the Soviets had not yet decided to push hard enough in any single place to break through entirely. He said all of this without drama. He said it the way a man describes the condition of a road he has just driven. Matter of fact, almost bored, except that in Haas, the apparent boredom always concealed something more careful underneath. He had learned, somewhere in the years of this war, to present catastrophe in the tone of a weather report. That was the most disturbing thing about it, not the content. I had expected something like what he described, but the tone. The tone told me that the men commanding these divisions had moved so far beyond shock that shock had become their baseline. They no longer reacted to the severity of the situation because the severity had become the situation. It was simply the world they lived in. I asked him about reserves. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been asked a question he considers technically answered by everything he has just said. There were no reserves, he told me. Everything was in the line. Every man, every vehicle, every piece of artillery he had was deployed forward, because if he pulled anything back to create a reserve, the position it vacated would cease to exist within hours. I thanked him and returned to my command vehicle. On the drive back to the school that served as my headquarters, I watched the Ukrainian landscape move past the frosted window and thought about the word reserves. In 40 years of military service, the absence of reserves had always been the sign that a formation had moved from fighting to surviving. You fight with what you have. You survive on reserves. When the reserves are gone, you are no longer fighting. You are simply absorbing pressure until the absorption capacity runs out, which is how a front stops being a front and becomes a catastrophe. I first became aware of Alexei Volkov not through any intelligence report, but through the maps themselves. Every morning, my operations officer updated the situation charts based on the overnight reports from the divisions. Every morning, I studied those updates for 10 or 15 minutes before the first briefing, and every morning I noticed the same pattern. Volkov was not where I expected him to be, not in the gross sense. His main formations were advancing on Kharkov as anticipated, and the direction of his effort was consistent with what our intelligence predicted. But in the details, in the specific locations where his reconnaissance probed and where his assault units applied pressure, he consistently chose the points that I would have chosen. Not the obvious weak spots, not the places where our defensive positions were thinnest in the most visible way. The places where the thinness was invisible from a distance, but apparent to a commander who understood how defensive lines actually work, where units are stretched just beyond their ability to reinforce each other, where the terrain creates corridors that look like nothing on a map but function as highways for infiltration on the ground. He found those places because he was looking for them, which meant he understood what to look for, which meant he was thinking the way I was thinking. This told me more about Volkov than any intelligence assessment could have. I did not know his background, his training, whether he had come up through the cavalry or the armor or the infantry. What I knew was that he moved like a professional. He did not waste men on frontal assaults where oblique pressure would accomplish the same result more cheaply. He was patient in a way that aggressive commanders rarely are, willing to wait a day, 2 days, for the right moment rather than forcing action before conditions were favorable. I respected this in the way a chess player respects an opponent who plays better than expected. And I was afraid of it in the way a chess player is afraid when he realizes he is already 2 moves behind and has not yet understood how it happened. On February 9th, Belgorod fell. I learned of it from a dispatch that arrived from General Hubert Stern's headquarters more than 3 hours after the city changed hands. The delay itself was information. It told me how badly the communications throughout the sector had degraded. And when it told me something about the state of Stern's staff that I filed away without comment. Belgorod was to the north of our position. Its fall meant that the left flank of the entire Kharkov defensive arrangement was now exposed. The Das Schwert regiments that Reimer had finally stabilized east of the Donets were being outflanked from behind. If the Soviet forces that had taken Belgorod turned south, and they would turn south, because a commander like Volkov would understand immediately what Belgorod's fall made possible, they could reach the rear of Reimer's position before he could react. I ordered Reimer to begin withdrawing his forward regiments to the west bank of the Donets. It was not a difficult decision from a military standpoint. It was the only logical option. But it meant giving up ground. And giving up ground was something that the Führer's headquarters had defined, in orders that descended through the chain of command with the weight of absolute law as inadmissible. Stern transmitted the confirmation of my order with the expression I had come to recognize in officers who understood the gap between the orders they were required to relay and the reality those orders had to navigate. He was a mountain warfare officer, a decent and professional man who found himself commanding a sector that had nothing to do with mountains and everything to do with the particular nightmare of a collapsing front. He looked tired in a way that went beyond the physical. He had deep circles under his eyes and the restless hands of a man who keeps reaching for options that are not there. I presented my assessment plainly, that Kharkov could not be held indefinitely with available forces, was that Soviet pressure would increase once Volkov concentrated his armor, that the Totenschädel division still had not arrived from France. Stern listened. He nodded. Then he told me the order was to hold Kharkov. He said it without emphasis, almost like an apology. General Franz Kroll arrived at my command post on a morning in mid-February that I remember for the cold more than anything else. Even by the standards of that winter, it was brutal, the kind of cold that made metal brittle and thought slow, that turned the air in your lungs into something that had to be consciously processed rather than simply breathed. Kroll arrived in a command vehicle caked with frozen mud, wearing a leather coat that seemed to be his personal uniform, and he carried with him an energy that was almost violent in its contrast to everything around him. He was younger than Haas, younger than Reimer, and he moved through the room with the impatience of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to happen and is finally ready for it now. His division, the Totenschädel, had been in France for months. His men were rested. Their equipment was new. Their ammunition was full. By every measurable standard, the Totenschädel was the most combat-ready formation I had, which made Kroll's arrival the best operational news I had received since deploying to Ukraine. He briefed me on the state of his division with the vigor that was characteristic of him. His men were ready, he said. They had waited too long in France while others bled on the Eastern Front. He said it with an intensity that was not quite normal. Not the controlled energy of a commander who has learned to project confidence for the benefit of his staff, but something raw, something that lived very close to the surface. I needed what he had brought me. That was not a small thing. Without the Totenschädel, the Corps had a gap where a flank should have been, and Volkov had been probing that gap with the patient precision I had come to expect from him. But Kroll came with a history that I knew, and that the Army preferred not to discuss. The concentration camp system, the inspectorate, the years before he became the combat commander he was now. The years when his name appeared in documents that describe things I will not detail here, because the details are not the point. The point is that I knew, and Kroll knew that I knew, and neither of us said a word about it. He finished his briefing. I gave him his operational assignment. He acknowledged it with the crisp professionalism that characterized everything he did in a military context, and then he left to bring his division into position. I sat alone in the map room for several minutes after he departed. I had made a decision by not making a decision. I had chosen to employ Kroll's division, which I needed to survive, without asking the questions that his presence raised. This is the particular corruption of operational necessity. It provides a reason for every silence, a justification for every willful blindness. You need what the man has brought you. You set aside what the man has done. You tell yourself that the battlefield is not the place for those reckonings, that there will be time for justice later, even when the immediate crisis has passed. I had told myself this. I was not certain I believed it. I was not certain it mattered what I believed. In that specific moment, in that specific room, with the maps showing what they showed and the numbers adding up to what they added up to. What I knew was that 20,000 men needed a third division, and the third division had arrived, and its commander had a pass that the Army had decided was irrelevant to the present. I returned to the maps, and that was what I always returned to. The days that followed Kroll's arrival settled into the brutal rhythm of a defensive campaign that has lost its coherence. Reports arrived, were processed, were acted upon, were superseded by new reports that contradicted the previous ones. Positions held were lost, were partially retaken, were lost again. The Soviet pressure was not spectacular. Volkov's armies were also exhausted. Their divisions reduced to fractions of their authorized strength. But it was constant and methodical, and aimed with the precision I had come to associate with Volkov's particular way of thinking. By the evening of February 13th, the situation had taken the shape of something I had seen before. The Soviet forces were converging on Kharkov from three directions: the north, the east, the southeast. The only open direction was to the southwest, toward the supply base at Krasnograd. If that direction closed, if Volkov committed forces to seal it while the main pressure continued from the other three sides, the Corps would be encircled. The encirclement would not happen in a day. It would happen in the way that all military catastrophes happen, incrementally, gradually, through the accumulation of small disadvantages until the moment when the accumulated weight became irreversible. My intelligence officer estimated that the southwestern corridor would remain open for 24 to 48 hours. After that, the assessment became purely mathematical. I sat in the map room that night after the last officer had gone to rest. The stove had gone out and the cold was pressing through the walls with a determination that felt almost personal. The lamp flickered. The maps spread across the desks cast shadows that moved when the flame moved, as though the positions on the charts were alive and shifting in real time. And then, at 2200 hours on the evening of February 13th, the message arrived that closed the last possibility of ambiguity. My signals officer brought it to me personally, which told me something before I read a word. He placed it on the table in front of me and stepped back, and his face had the expression of a man delivering something he did not want to have touched. I read it. Hold Kharkov at all costs. Do not yield the city under any circumstances. Every position is a fortress. Every soldier will defend his post to the end. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the map, next to the red arrows that showed Volkov's forces pressing from three directions, and I looked at the whole picture for a long time without moving. The language was almost identical to the orders that had been transmitted to Paulus in the final weeks of Stalingrad. Hold at all costs. Would every position a fortress. Not one step back. Phrases that sound like heroism from an office in Berlin. That mean extermination on the ground. I did not respond that night. I told my aide I was retiring and asked not to be disturbed unless a division commander requested contact personally. Then I went to the small room that had been the school headmaster's office, sat down on the military cot that had served as my bed for 2 weeks, and looked at the wall. Outside, the snow had started again. I could hear it. Not the snow itself, which makes no sound, but the particular silence that snow creates. The way it muffles everything until the world narrows to the distance a man can see from a single window. I had 20,000 men. I knew what the orders said. And I knew, with the clarity that comes to a man at 62 who has stopped deceiving himself about what he knows, that the order was going to get them all killed. The question was what I was going to do about it. Not whether. I had already, without quite acknowledging it, moved past the question of whether. I had moved to the question of how and when and at what cost to myself and to every officer in the chain of command between me and the order I was about to disobey. That was where the night stood, not with a decision, with the moment before a decision, which is its own kind of weight. The maps were still wrong. The stoves had gone cold. And outside, Volkov's forces moved in the dark with the patience of a man who knows exactly where the gaps are. The operations room ran on a logic of its own that had nothing to do with the logic of the war outside. Reports came in. They were processed. Positions were updated on the maps with wax pencil that could be erased and redrawn when the next report arrived with different information, which it usually did. My operations officer had been at this for 3 weeks without a day off, and his eyes had the particular flatness of a man who has been reading bad news for so long that the news has ceased to produce the reactions that bad news is supposed to produce. He processed each report with the same expression he had used for the first report on the first day, and I considered that a form of professionalism that deserved recognition, even if the circumstances prevented me from offering it. The communication situation had deteriorated to the point where a functioning radio felt like a gift. The landlines were cut by Soviet patrols almost as fast as they could be repaired, which meant that most of our communication with the divisions happened over radio, with the interference that the weather and the distance produced. Messages arrived in fragments. Sometimes a position was reported held, and 30 minutes later, a second fragment arrived reporting the same position lost. Sometimes the fragments from a single transmission were scattered over 20 minutes of static and had to be reassembled by the signals officer like pieces of a puzzle that had been dropped on the floor. Both things could be true simultaneously. A position could be held and lost at the same time, in the sense that part of it was held and part of it was lost, and the part that was lost was the part through which the enemy was currently moving. War has that quality. It allows opposite things to occupy the same space at the same time, and the function of a command post is to impose enough order on that simultaneity to make decisions possible, knowing that every decision is based on information that is already slightly out of date by the time it is acted on. I had spent 40 years learning to make decisions with incomplete information. The Eastern Front in February 1943 was simply an extreme version of something that had always been true. The incompleteness was greater, the speed of change was faster, the consequences of error were more immediate and less forgiving. But the fundamental problem was the same problem that commanders had faced in every war in every century. You never know enough, and you have to decide anyway. And the quality of your decisions is ultimately measured not by how much you knew, but by how well you reasoned from what you had. By February 12th, the picture on the maps had become clear enough that no amount of static or fragmentation could obscure it. The Soviet forces were closing in on Kharkov from 3 directions simultaneously. Volkov was not rushing. He was methodical. He was applying pressure in the way a vice applies pressure, not a single blow, but a continuous, patient force that increases gradually and allows no relief and no adjustment. The city was not yet encircled. But the shape of the encirclement was visible to anyone who could read a map, and the time available before the shape became a reality was shortening with each passing hour. I had been in this position before, in different wars and different theaters, and the sensation it produced was always the same. Not fear in the ordinary sense. Fear requires uncertainty about the outcome. What I felt in those days was something more like the recognition of inevitability. The understanding that a certain sequence of events, unless interrupted by a deliberate act, would proceed to its natural conclusion. The conclusion was encirclement and destruction. The deliberate act required to interrupt the sequence was the thing that no one in the chain of command above me was willing to authorize. The evening of the 12th, I reviewed the numbers one more time. 20,000 men. And the arithmetic had not changed. It would not change. Arithmetic does not respond to orders or to rhetoric or to the political requirements of a headquarters that needs a city to remain on the map in a particular color. It responds only to the facts it is given, and the facts were what they were. I turned off the lamp and lay down on the cot without undressing. The cold had settled into the building in the particular way it settled in the deep hours of the night. Even when the stoves had burned low and the warmth they had generated during the day had been absorbed and dissipated and replaced by the cold that pressed in from the Ukrainian darkness. I lay in that cold and looked at the ceiling and thought about what was coming, which was the order I knew was coming, and what I would do when it arrived. I thought about it with the same deliberate calm I had tried to bring to every decision in 40 years of service. Not the calm of a man who does not understand the stakes, the calm of a man who understands them completely and has decided that understanding them requires a clear head rather than a panicked one. The stakes were my career, my freedom, possibly my life. These things happened to officers who disobeyed direct orders, and I had no illusions about my special immunity to consequences that had befallen others. The stakes were also 20,000 men. I held both sets of stakes in my mind and looked at them, and the comparison was not difficult. It had never been difficult, if I was honest with myself. The difficulty was not in the comparison. The difficulty was in the act of disobedience itself, in the violation of 40 years of training and instinct and professional formation that said, you follow orders, you work within the system, you advocate through proper channels and accept the outcome of that advocacy. And if the outcome is wrong, you file it away and move on. I had spent 40 years building the habit of that compliance. Breaking it was not a small thing, even when breaking it was the right thing. The order arrived the next evening. I read it. I set it down. I went to the headmaster's office and sat in the dark and thought about Paulus and about the 600 kilometers between Berlin and Kharkov and about the specific weight of 20,000 lives. And then the morning came, sorry, and with it the 14th of February and the longest day of the war. The 14th of February began at 5:30 in the morning with a report that should not have surprised me and did anyway. Reimer's voice on the radio was flat in the way that voices become flat when the person speaking has moved past the register of alarm into something colder and more precise. He reported that Das Schwert had lost control of the southeastern sector during the night. Soviet armor had penetrated the junction between two of his battalions at a point his forward observers had flagged as vulnerable 2 days earlier. The penetration was not large and perhaps 2 kilometers, but it had split his defensive arrangement in a way that would require his last reserve battalion to seal. I asked him to confirm that detail. His last reserve battalion. He confirmed it without elaboration. When a division commander commits his last reserve, the division has ceased to be a formation capable of maneuver. It becomes a static line that can only hold or break. There is no third option. I had known this for 40 years, and the knowledge had never felt as specific as it did at 5:30 on the morning of February 14th. Listening to Reimer's precise voice describe the end of his options. I asked him whether he could maintain his positions for 24 more hours. There was a pause that lasted long enough to mean something. He said he did not know, that it depended on what Volkov did. If the Soviets concentrated their armor against a single point, no. If they continued pressing along the entire front, perhaps. He said perhaps the way a man says it when he means something closer to unlikely, but not yet impossible. I set the handset down and looked at the map. Half an hour after Reimer's call, Haas reported by radio that his grenadiers were fighting in the eastern suburbs of Kharkov. Our Soviet T-34s had penetrated as far as the industrial district, using the factory buildings as cover and the wide avenues as fields of fire. Haas described the situation with his characteristic economy. His men were holding, he said, but the gaps between positions were too wide to cover, and the Soviets were finding them faster than he could seal them. He asked, in the tone of a man who already knows the answer, whether reinforcements were coming. I told him the Totenschädel was in position to the northwest, but could not be redirected without opening the flank Kroll's division was covering. Haas made a sound I interpreted as professional acknowledgement and ended the transmission. At 9 in the morning, I convened a staff meeting in the side room off the main operations hall. 5 officers, 1 map. No adjectives, no opinions. I had enforced that rule since the first day of the campaign. Facts and positions only. When my operations officer finished his presentation, we all looked at the map in silence for a moment and saw the same thing. An encirclement taking shape. Soviet forces pressing from the north, the east, and the southeast. The only open direction, southwest, toward Krasnograd and the supply base. My intelligence officer estimated the southwestern corridor would remain passable for 24 to 48 hours. My logistics officer reported fuel for a motorized withdrawal of 60 to 80 kilometers, provided the roads were passable. The roads were covered in compacted snow over frozen mud that turned to ice at night. I asked my operations officer for his professional assessment of the viability of holding the city for a prolonged period. He looked at me for a moment before answering. Then he said, in the long, careful sentences of a staff officer who understands that what he is saying will become part of a record, that in his professional opinion, the defense of Kharkov with available forces was possible for 2 or 3 more days, but that beyond that time frame, the Soviet penetrations would irreversibly compromise the integrity of the perimeter, and that an orderly withdrawal would become progressively more difficult until it became impossible. He did not say, if we stay, and we will be destroyed. But that is what he said. I thanked him and dismissed the officers. At noon, I sent the first message to Stern. I had drafted it carefully, the way you draft a document that you know will be read by people who are looking for reasons to deny what it asks. I laid out the tactical situation in figures and distances and time estimates. I described the state of the divisions without adjectives. I presented the threat of encirclement as a mathematical projection, not a fear. I used the word withdrawal once, positioned in the middle of a paragraph dense with operational detail, hoping that its placement might soften the weight it carried. I did not use the words impossible or disobedience. I used numbers. I thought numbers would speak for themselves. Stern's reply arrived an hour later. It was negative. The Führer's order was to hold Kharkov. There was no room for interpretation. I read the reply and set it beside the map. Then I drafted a second message, and a less diplomatic than the first. I reported that the situation was critical, that encirclement was imminent, that the destruction of the SS Panzer Corps was a real possibility if immediate withdrawal was not authorized. I requested an urgent response. The response came quickly, and it did not come from Stern. It came from a higher echelon, bypassing Stern entirely, one which told me something about how the chain of command was functioning, or rather about how it functioned when the Führer's headquarters wanted to ensure a message arrived without the possibility of modification at intermediate levels. A single word repeated, "Hold." And beneath it, in the encrypted transmission, something I had not seen before in a formal military communication. The word underlined, as though typographic emphasis could alter the reality on the ground. As though whoever had composed the message believed that underlining a word in a ciphertext would reach through the radio, and the cold, and the maps, and the Soviet armor, and change the arithmetic of the situation. I looked at that underlined word for a long time. Then I put the message down and went to find my aide, and told him I would not be available for the next hour unless a division commander requested contact personally. And the headmaster's office was small and cold and smelled of damp wood and old paper, as it had since the first day I had used it as a bedroom. The military cot against one wall, the kerosene lamp on the desk that I turned low until it gave just enough light to see by without filling the room. The single window that looked out on a courtyard filled with snow that had not been disturbed since the school was evacuated. I sat on the cot. I thought about Paulus, not as a lesson in military history, not as an abstraction invoked to justify a conclusion I had already reached. I thought about him as a man I had known, a careful and professional and thoroughly trained officer who had received an order to hold Stalingrad and had complied with that order through every stage of its consequences. He had held when holding was still possible. He had held when it was barely possible. He had held when it was impossible, and the impossible had played out in the only way the impossible can play out. Mach 250,000 men, 90,000 prisoners marching towards Siberia in the winter of 1943. 150,000 dead beneath the snow of a city reduced to rubble. The most powerful German formation on the Eastern Front, destroyed not in a battle but in a siege that everyone with access to a map and common sense had understood, was unwinnable from the moment the encirclement closed. Paulus had obeyed. His obedience was legally impeccable, and it was professionally consistent with everything his training and his oath required. It was the kind of obedience that the system was designed to produce, that it rewarded at every level until the level where reward ceased to be possible because the men who would have given it were dead. I thought about the word obedience for a long time in that cold room. I thought about what it means to obey an order that you know will destroy the men under your command. Whether obedience in that circumstance is a military virtue or a transfer of moral responsibility, a way of ensuring that when the destruction comes, the hands that ordered it bear the guilt rather than the hands that executed it. Whether that transfer of responsibility is honorable or whether it is simply a sophisticated form of abdication. I thought about 20,000 men, not as a number, as the faces I had seen in the preceding weeks. Hass at the farmhouse near the Donets, he describing the front's non-existence in the tone of a weather report. Reimer's flat voice on the radio at 5:30 that morning, confirming that his last reserve was committed. The soldiers I had passed on the road 2 days earlier, moving to new positions in the dark, their breath visible in the cold, their faces carrying the particular expression of men who have been at the edge of their endurance long enough that the edge has become the baseline. Those men had not chosen me as their commander. They had been assigned to me by a system that had also assigned them to a situation that was trying to kill them. And my function in that system, the function that justified every rank I had ever held, every school I had attended, every year I had spent learning the trade, was to keep them alive long enough to fight another day. Not to preserve the map, not to satisfy the political requirements of a headquarters 800 kilometers away, not to maintain my record of compliance with orders that had no connection to the ground on which those orders had to be executed, to keep them alive. The lamp flickered. The cold pressed through the walls. Outside, artillery rumbled in the low continuous register that had become so constant I only noticed it in the moments when it briefly stopped. I made the decision. It was not a moment of illumination. It was not dramatic in the way that decisive moments are portrayed in the accounts written afterward by people who were not present for them. It was something colder than drama, more deliberate than impulse. A calculation completed, a conclusion reached. The kind of decision that, once made, does not feel like a decision so much as a recognition. The acknowledgement of something that has been true for longer than the moment of acknowledgement. I called my operations officer. I told him to prepare a withdrawal plan toward the southwest, direction Krasnograd, with execution beginning at dawn on the 15th of February. He looked at me with an expression I could not fully interpret. It might have been relief. It might have been alarm. It was probably both, in proportions that shifted as he absorbed what I had said. Then I added the instruction that both of us understood was the most consequential part of the order. I told him to be discreet with the communications. I did not want Stern to know before the movement was underway. He held my gaze for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he said he would have the plan ready in 2 hours and left. I sat alone in the map room for the next hour. The thing I had just done, the thing I had set in motion, was not administratively complex. Orders would be drafted. Units would be assigned axes of withdrawal. Fuel and ammunition would be redistributed. The machine of a military headquarters, which is designed to implement decisions once decisions are made, would function with the efficiency it always functioned with, regardless of whether the decision it was implementing had authorization from the chain of command. That was the practical dimension. The other dimension was simpler and more absolute. I had received a direct order from the Führer's headquarters. The order said hold. I had decided to withdraw. The distance between those two words could be measured in destroyed careers, in military tribunals, in the particular vocabulary of consequences that the system applied to officers who substituted their judgment for the judgment of command. I knew this. I had known it before I made the decision, which is why the decision had taken the form it took. Not impulsive, not reactive, but deliberate. A calculation that included the consequences for myself as one of the variables, weighted against the other variables, and reached a conclusion. The conclusion was that 20,000 men outweighed a career. It was not a heroic thought. It was an arithmetic thought. The same cold calculation applied to a different set of numbers. At 10 that night, I communicated the decision to Haas and Reimer. Haas responded with something that, in the medium of radio communication, sounded like controlled approval. He asked no questions about authorization. I suspected he already understood the answer to that question and had decided, in the pragmatic way that was characteristic of him, that the answer was less relevant than the order itself. Reimer acknowledged receipt and asked about the order of march, with the precision that defined everything he did. I gave it to him. He confirmed and ended the transmission. Kroll's division acknowledged with the efficiency of men executing instructions without question. The plan was in motion. The withdrawal began before dawn on the 15th of February. And I monitored it from a command vehicle on the road to Krasnograd, following the movement by radio as the columns formed and began to move. The night was cold even by the standards of that winter. Well below zero, the kind of cold that made metal contract and engines reluctant, and the simple act of moving through open ground a sustained physical effort. The sky was clear, which meant the temperature would not rise and the roads would stay frozen and the vehicles would have traction. And the Leibgard moved along the southwestern roads while Das Schwert covered the eastern flank. The columns traveled with lights off, the vehicle engines running as quietly as could be managed, the sound muffled by the snow that lay over everything. My operations officer reported from the command post that communications with all three divisions were functioning, which was more than could be said for most nights of the preceding weeks. The Soviets detected the movement after several hours. Volkov had positioned his forces for a siege, not a pursuit. His armor was deployed in the arc around the city's eastern and northern approaches, oriented towards static defensive positions that he expected to reduce methodically over the following days. When his reconnaissance elements reported that the positions were emptying, that the columns they had been watching through their observation posts were moving away from the city rather than reinforcing it, the reaction required a reorganization that his formations were not immediately configured to execute. That gap was what I had been counting on, not Volkov's incompetence. He was not incompetent. The gap existed because professional soldiers plan for what they expect to face, and Volkov had expected a static defense. He had prepared for it. He had positioned his forces to exploit it, and the withdrawal denied him the exploitation he had prepared for, requiring him to improvise a pursuit operation with formations that were oriented, armed, and supplied for a different kind of fight. The improvisation took time. The time was enough. It was not clean. Nothing about it was clean. There were units that did not receive the withdrawal order in time. Companies and platoons too deeply engaged with Soviet forward elements to disengage without a fight they could not afford. Some broke contact and withdrew under fire, absorbing casualties in the movement. Others could not break contact at all. There were vehicles that ran out of fuel on the icy roads and had to be abandoned. Tanks and supply trucks pushed into roadside ditches, stripped of anything useful, left behind. And there were wounded in the forward aid stations who could not be moved, who received instructions to surrender when the Soviets arrived, along with the unspoken knowledge that surrender on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1943 was not a guarantee of anything. But the Corps got out. The two main divisions crossed the covering positions southwest of the city with their command structures intact, their armor, their artillery, the majority of their men. Not intact in the sense of undamaged. Weeks of combat had damaged everything, but coherent, capable of further action, not a pocket, not a destruction. That was all I had been trying to achieve. When my aide informed me at first light that the last elements had crossed the covering positions and the roads to Krasnograd were open, I sat in the command vehicle and looked at the eastern sky, told her where the darkness was beginning to separate from the horizon in the pale gray way it does before dawn on the steppe. Behind me, to the northeast, Soviet artillery was bombarding positions that had been vacated hours earlier. The shells were falling on empty buildings and abandoned equipment, and the particular silence of a city that had just changed hands. A few minutes later, my operations officer informed me that Stern had been notified of the withdrawal. The word he used to characterize Stern's reaction was measured. I suspected the reality was considerably less temperate. The days that followed the withdrawal had the compressed quality of a situation reorganizing itself faster than anyone could fully track. The Corps settled around Krasnograd with the efficiency of formations that have learned to establish themselves quickly. Fuel was distributed, ammunition was redistributed. Haas came to see me in person on the 17th. So arriving at the collective farm, we had converted into a command post in a vehicle caked with frozen mud. He sat across from me and told me his men were exhausted but whole. That morale had held better than he expected, precisely because the withdrawal had given the soldiers the sense that someone above them had been thinking about their survival rather than just about the map. He mentioned the casualties with the verbal economy of a man who has counted too many dead to dwell on each one. And then he looked at me with the directness that had always been his most unsettling characteristic and asked whether something was going to come down on me because of Kharkov. I told him it probably would. He nodded as though the answer confirmed what he had already decided. Then he left without adding anything more. That was Haas. He asked the question he needed to ask, received the answer, and moved on. On the 26th of February, 11 days after the withdrawal from Kharkov, a message arrived from the Totenschädel staff that was shorter than their messages typically were. It reported that General Franz Kroll had departed in a Fiesler Stork toward the division's forward positions earlier that morning, that the aircraft had not reached its destination, that communication with the plane had been lost shortly after takeoff, and that search operations were underway. I read the message twice. I set it on the table. I looked at the map. Kroll had been flying low over contested ground where the line between German forward positions and Soviet rearguards was a mosaic that changed by the hour. A Fiesler Storch was a light observation aircraft, slow and unarmed, designed for reconnaissance at low altitude. It was exactly the kind of aircraft a commander like Kroll would use for exactly the kind of flight he was making. Close enough to the ground to see what his subordinates described to him on the radio. We're close enough to identify the things that only direct observation can identify. He had flown over combat zones many times before. It was not recklessness in the sense of carelessness. It was a principle he held about what command meant. You lead from where you can see. You do not command from the rear. I had heard him express something like this once, in response to a suggestion that he considers safer transit routes. He had responded with a gesture that required no words. The confirmation arrived at nightfall. Elements of the Totenschädel had located the remains of the Fiesler Stork in an open field several kilometers from the Soviet lines. The aircraft had been hit by anti-aircraft fire at low altitude and had crashed. Kroll and his pilot were dead. I set the confirmation beside the first message and remained at the table for several minutes without moving. I had not liked Franz Kroll. Perhaps that is an insufficient way to describe a relationship that was never simple enough to be reduced to personal feeling. But it is the honest starting point. He had energy and operational capability and the particular aggressive confidence that makes certain commanders effective in ways that more measured men cannot replicate. His division had fought well. His men had performed under pressure with the cohesion of a formation that trusted its leader. Now, all of that was true and professionally significant, but his death forced me to think about something I had not permitted myself to examine while he was alive. Franz Kroll had come to my command carrying a history, the camps, the inspectorate, the systematic organization of machinery whose purpose was the destruction of people who had not committed any offense that a human being should recognize as an offense. That history was not a rumor, and it was not a matter of degree. It was documented, was known at every level of the SS hierarchy, and treated, in the operational context of 1943, as a chapter that had closed when Kroll transitioned from administrator to combat commander. I had accepted that treatment. I had needed his division, and I had taken it, and I had not asked the questions that his presence raised. And I had told myself that the battlefield was not the place for those reckonings, that there would be time for justice later. There was not time for justice later. Right? There was an anti-aircraft burst at low altitude over a contested field in Ukraine, and then there was a notification to the Army Group staff and the beginning of a change of command process. Franz Kroll had died before any accounting could reach him. I did not know what to call that. Justice was not the right word, and its absence was not quite the right word either. It was the particular moral condition of a war that kills without reference to guilt or innocence. That distributes death with the impartiality of weather, that ends some reckonings before they can begin and extends others indefinitely beyond the point where they are still meaningful. What I knew, what I allowed myself to acknowledge in the privacy of that moment, was that my silence in the map room when Kroll first reported had made me something I did not want to be. Not a war criminal in the direct sense, and but a participant in the decision to set aside what I knew in favor of what I needed. The operational necessity had been real. The necessity did not cancel the choice. The choice remained, and it remained mine. I sat with that for the minutes it deserved. Then I returned to the maps. Falk was somewhere in a hospital in Germany, or perhaps home by now, or perhaps neither. I had not asked. I had not sent word. That too was a kind of answer to a question I had not permitted myself to ask fully. As the war moved on, it always moved on. 2 days after the confirmation of Kroll's death, my signals officer patched through a secure radio connection to Field Marshal Erwin Vogel's headquarters. The connection was brief. The communications infrastructure that permitted extended conversations between command echelons was not reliable enough to waste, but it was sufficient. Vogel did not begin with Kharkov. He began with the operational picture, which told me something about how he had processed the events of the preceding weeks. He described the Soviet situation in the southern sector with the precision of a man who had been watching it develop for longer than the crisis had been visible to anyone else. The Soviet armies that had advanced so boldly since Stalingrad were overextended. Their supply lines ran hundreds of kilometers across damaged rail lines and winter roads. Their armor was wearing out faster than it could be repaired. Their divisions had been in continuous action since January and were operating at fractions of their authorized strength. General Popov's mobile group, the most aggressive Soviet formation in the southwest, had advanced so far that its 4 tank corps were now separated from each other and from the infantry that should have supported them. What looked on the map like a threatening deep penetration was, on the ground, a series of isolated formations running low on fuel and ammunition and incapable of the coordinated action that had made them dangerous in January. Vogel intended to strike. He outlined the concept in the compressed language that secure radio required. The SS Panzer Corps would move south, cutting the supply lines feeding Popov's group. Simultaneously, other formations would attack from the east. when the effect would be the destruction of the most advanced Soviet forces and the stabilization of the entire southern sector. He needed the corps intact to execute this, and the corps was intact because I had withdrawn it from Kharkov. Neither of us said this directly. It was not the kind of thing that was said directly in the German military in February 1943, when the open acknowledgement of a disobeyed order, even one that had produced the precise operational outcome you needed, was not something the chain of command could formally accommodate. But before the transmission ended, Vogel said something that I have carried with me since that morning in a way that few things said to me in 40 years of service have been carried. He said, "The preservation of your corps in February was not a failure. It was the prerequisite for what we are about to do. Whatever comes from Berlin about the decision you made, and something will come, do not allow anyone to convince you that it was anything other than what it was." He ended the transmission. I stood at the radio table for a moment after the connection closed. Then I called my operations officer and told him to begin preparing the corps for offensive operations. The intelligence intercepts from Volkov's sector during those preparatory days revealed something that I found more meaningful than the operational figures my staff compiled each night. Volkov had seen the overextension coming. The intercepts included fragments of communications from his headquarters that, read in sequence, showed a commander who had understood the vulnerability being created by the Soviet advance before Vogel began to exploit it. He had sent assessments upward when he had argued for a consolidation, a shortening of the lines, a pause to allow logistics to catch up with the tactical success. His chain of command had not listened because his chain of command was in the momentum of a successful offensive and did not want to hear from the officer who was telling them to stop. He had been right. He had been ignored. And now his armies would experience the consequences of the gap between what he had known and what his system would permit him to act on. Two professional officers on opposite sides of the same front, both seeing clearly what the situation required, both operating within systems that were capable of ignoring clear sight when clear sight was inconvenient. The difference between us, the difference that would determine the outcome, was not a matter of military competence or professional judgment. The difference was that I had disobeyed, and Volkov had not. I did not feel satisfaction at this. What I felt was something closer to the recognition of how thin the line was. If the circumstances had been slightly different, if the operational mathematics had been slightly less stark, if the timing had been slightly off, or any of a dozen variables had shifted, I might have obeyed too. I might have made the same choice Volkov made, for reasons that would have seemed just as sound in the moment. The fact that I had made the other choice did not make me wiser. It made me luckier. In the specific sense that the situation had presented itself in terms stark enough to overcome the enormous institutional pressure toward compliance that every professional soldier carries like a second skeleton. The counterattack began on the 19th of February, and within 48 hours, it had acquired the quality that good operations acquire when conditions align, a momentum that fed itself, each advance creating the conditions for the next. De Schwert and the Totenschädel moved in parallel southward, cutting supply routes, overrunning logistical positions, finding Soviet units that could not respond because they lacked the fuel to move and the ammunition to fight effectively. By the 24th of February, the offensive had transformed into a pursuit. Popov's mobile group had ceased to exist as a coherent force. The Soviet 25th Tank Corps, completely out of fuel, abandoned all its vehicles and withdrew on foot through the snow. Dozens of tanks left in the fields, with their engines still warm, captured intact by my forward units. The arrows on the map pointed south for now. Soon they would turn north, and everything I had preserved in February, every man, every tank, every gun, would be the instrument of what came next. That was the arithmetic of the decision made in 10 minutes in a cold room on the night of February 14th. 20,000 men, alive, the account with Berlin open, the war continuing, and ahead of us growing clearer with each day of the pursuit, the city of Kharkov, waiting to be retaken by the same corps that had abandoned it. The counterattack that began on the 19th of February had a quality to it that I had not felt since the early campaigns. The quality of an operation in which everything that can go right is going right, not because of luck but because the conditions have been carefully constructed to allow it. Vogel had done something that only the best operational commanders can do. He had seen, weeks in advance, what the situation would look like at a specific future moment, and he had positioned his forces to exploit that moment before the moment arrived. The Soviet overextension was not an accident that Vogel had discovered. It was an outcome that he had anticipated and, to some extent, Moshe deliberately cultivated by allowing the Soviet advance to continue a little further than it needed to before striking. Das Schwert and the Totenschädel drove south through a landscape that told the story of what had happened to Popov's mobile group more vividly than any intelligence report could. The roads were littered with the evidence of an army that had advanced faster than its logistics could follow. Abandoned vehicles. So supply dumps that had been looted by the retreating formations before they could be secured. Field hospitals set up in farmhouses and then evacuated in haste, leaving behind equipment and, in some cases, patients who had been too sick or too badly wounded to move. Artillery pieces that had run out of shells and been spiked by their crews before withdrawal. The detritus of an offensive that had believed too completely in its own momentum. My forward units reported capturing Soviet soldiers who had been marching for days through the snow, separated from their units, without food, without adequate winter clothing, looking not for a fight but for someone to surrender to. I received these reports and processed them with the professional detachment that the operational pace required. There was no time for anything else. But in the evenings, reviewing the day's reports in the farmhouse command post, and I thought about what those men represented. Not as statistics, not as the diminishing combat power of a disintegrating formation, but as men who had been sent into a situation that their commanders had not managed well, who were now paying the price of that mismanagement in the particular currency of the Eastern Front, which did not offer generous exchange rates. I thought about Volkov, and not with sympathy. Sympathy was not a luxury that the operational situation permitted, but with the professional recognition that one competent officer extends to another who has been placed in an impossible situation by forces outside his control. Volkov had seen the vulnerability. He had reported it. He had been overruled by a headquarters that confused the momentum of success with the permanence of success, or that looked at the arrows on the map pointing westward and saw victory instead of overextension. And now his armies were in retreat and his mobile group was destroyed, and the winter offensive that had seemed, in January, to be the culmination of Stalingrad's momentum had been turned into a disaster by the same deliberate operational thinking that Vogel had applied with such precision. There was a symmetry in that which I found impossible not to notice. Two professional officers, two systems, to two moments of institutional failure. Volkov had been right and been ignored. I had been right, or had acted as though I were right, and had been disobeyed. The difference between our situations was not that one of us had been correct and the other wrong. The difference was that I had acted on what I knew, and Volkov had not, or could not, or had chosen not to in the particular calculus of risks that every officer in every army performs when weighing personal judgment against institutional authority. I wondered, in the evenings, what Volkov was thinking in those days, whether he was reviewing the messages he had sent upward and finding them confirmed by everything that was now happening, whether that confirmation brought him any satisfaction, or whether it brought only the bitterness of a man who was right in a situation where being right was worth nothing because he had not been able to make being right matter. I did not know the answer. I would never know the answer, because Volkov and I would never meet, and because the Eastern Front does not provide the circumstances for the kind of conversation that would allow two enemies to compare notes on the institutional failures that had shaped the campaign they both fought. What I knew was that the arrows on my map were pointing south, and that the Corps was advancing, and that the 20,000 men I had preserved in February were the instrument of everything that was now happening. That was the arithmetic I returned to when the evenings threatened to become philosophical. The decisions had consequences. The consequences were visible on the map. The map was, for the moment, showing something that looked like success. By the 24th of February, the pursuit had covered more than 100 kilometers. The formations that had constituted the most dangerous Soviet penetration on the entire southern front had ceased to exist as fighting units. The supply lines feeding Vatutin's offensive were cut. The city of Kharkov, which the Soviets had taken on the 16th of February, and which the SS Panzer Corps had abandoned the day before that, was now surrounded on three sides by German forces that had not been there 2 weeks earlier. When the mathematics had changed, not in the sense that mathematics changes, the numbers were different, the positions were different, the balance of forces on the map was different, but the underlying fact that had been true since January remained true. The war was not over. The campaign was not decided, and the men who were alive today would be asked to do what living soldiers are always asked to do, which is prepare for what comes next. What came next was the order that arrived on the 6th of March with Kharkov's name on it. The silence from Berlin lasted 4 days. In the army, silence from the chain of command after an act of disobedience is not the same as silence in ordinary life. It is not neutral. It is not the absence of something. It is a presence, a deliberate, calculated pressure that communicates more precisely than any formal reprimand could. It says, we know what you did. We are deciding what it is worth to us. And in the meantime, you will wait. I waited. The Corps had reorganized southwest of Kharkov around Krasnograd, where the supply base gave us fuel and ammunition and the brief luxury of positions that were not actively being overrun. The divisions needed rest that could not be given to them. 48 hours would not repair what weeks of continuous combat had done to men and machines. But at least they could regroup without the immediate pressure of encirclement. At least the columns had stopped moving in the dark with their lights off. At least the map showed something approximating a coherent line rather than the fragments and gaps that had been our reality for most of February. Reimer sent me a written report more detailed than anything the radio had permitted during the withdrawal. Das Schwert had suffered proportionally more than the Leibgard because it had covered the eastern flank during the retreat. The most exposed position, the last to disengage, the formation that had absorbed Volkov's pursuing pressure while the rest of the Corps moved. Several of his battalions were reduced to company strength. Hogue had lost vehicles and heavy equipment on the icy roads southwest of the city. Tanks and self-propelled guns abandoned in roadside ditches when the ice made them immovable. But the divisional structure held. The regiments existed. They could fight. That was what mattered. It was the only thing that mattered. On the 17th of February, Hitler flew to Zaporizhzhia. I learned of it from an encrypted message from the Army Group staff, delivered mid-morning with the careful neutrality of communications that carry information everyone understands and no one states directly. The Führer had landed at Field Marshal Vogel's headquarters with his usual entourage, staff officers, security personnel, the apparatus that traveled everywhere with him and that transformed any location into an extension of the particular atmosphere of his command. The official purpose was strategic consultation. The real purpose was visible to anyone capable of reading between the lines. Someone was going to pay for Kharkov. I was not summoned to Zaporizhzhia. That itself was information. My absence from the meeting meant that the decision about my fate was being made without asking me to explain myself, which meant either that the explanation was considered irrelevant or that the decision had already been reached without requiring one. I was not certain which of those possibilities I preferred. What reached me from Zaporizhzhia came through the usual channels: fragments from staff officers who had been present, and careful second-hand accounts stripped of anything that could be considered a direct quotation. The particular vocabulary of information passed laterally through a military hierarchy that has learned to communicate sideways when the vertical channels are compromised by the proximity of power. Hitler had been furious. That word appeared in every account, in various forms, with various qualifications. Furious about Kharkov. Furious about the loss of a major Soviet city barely 3 weeks after Stalingrad. Furious that SS troops, the formations he considered the elite expression of the Reich's military will, had abandoned a city that his orders had declared inviolable. The fact that the withdrawal had saved 2 complete divisions from certain destruction did not enter his calculation. And the fact that those 2 divisions were now the spearhead of an offensive designed to stabilize the entire southern front did not register against the primary offense, which was that one of his orders had been disobeyed. I understood this in the cold analytical way that I understood most things. The system required obedience not because obedience always produced the best outcomes. Any competent officer could see that it did not. but because a command structure that permitted subordinates to substitute their judgment for the commander's judgment ceased to be a command structure. There was a logic to the fury, even if the logic led, in this specific case, to conclusions that would have destroyed everything. General Hubert Stern was relieved of command within days of the Zaporizhzhia meeting, the dispatch announcing it was brief and formal and said nothing about the actual reason, which everyone understood without being told. Stern had been the most accessible link in the chain between the Führer's order to hold Kharkov and the decision to abandon it. He had not made that decision, I had, but he had been positioned between the order and its violation, and the system needed someone to absorb the official consequence. Stern was a decent officer who had managed an impossible situation with insufficient resources, and he disappeared from the Eastern Front with the quiet efficiency of a man who has learned not to expect justice from institutional processes. As for me, the direct censure did not come. Not in the form I had anticipated, not the military tribunal, not the arrest, not the summary removal that I had considered a real possibility. What came instead was something more subtle and in some ways more lasting, a silence with a specific texture to it, the kind of silence that communicates, we know, we have not forgotten, we are keeping the account open. Vogel told me, in the secure communication before the counterattack orders arrived, that Hitler had considered the disobedience a mark that would not be erased, that he would not forget, that he would not entirely forgive, but that he could not, at this specific moment, dispense with the SS Panzer Corps, which was one of the few formations on the Southern Front capable of offensive action. Military utility had saved me from the immediate consequences, but the account remained open. And in the particular economy of that headquarters, accounts were never forgiven. They were only deferred. Those words required no elaboration. The connection between the preserved corps and the offensive now beginning was the acknowledgement that neither of us would put into any document. He ended the transmission. The static that replaced his voice felt like a different kind of silence than the silence from Berlin. Not hostile, not deferred, but finished. Then I called my operations officer and told him the corps would be ready to move. The arrows on the map were about to change direction. And the counterattack that began on the 19th of February achieved within 10 days something that the situation maps in early February had made seem nearly impossible. Popov's mobile group, the 4 Soviet tank corps that had driven so boldly westward, was destroyed as a coherent fighting force. The 25th Tank Corps abandoned all its vehicles and withdrew on foot. The supply lines feeding Vatutin's entire offensive were cut. The initiative on the Southern Front, waiting for the first time since Stalingrad, passed to German hands. My staff compiled the figures each night: prisoners, tanks destroyed or captured, artillery pieces. The numbers grew with each report, and I received them with the caution that experience had taught me to apply to figures gathered in the heat of the moment. But even with a wide margin of correction, the magnitude of what had happened was undeniable. Volkov's armies were in disorderly retreat toward the northern Donets. The offensive that had seemed, in February, to be the prelude to the complete collapse of the Southern Front had been reversed, and Vogel was already thinking about what came next. On the 6th of March, he launched the second phase of the offensive. The objective was Kharkov. I received the orders during the evening briefing and read them standing at the map table with my operations officer beside me. The city that I had been ordered to hold at all costs in February, sure that I had evacuated in the dark 3 weeks earlier, that the Soviet forces had occupied and consolidated, Kharkov was once again a German military objective. The circularity of this was not lost on me. I had left the city going one direction, and now I was returning from the opposite direction with the same formations toward the same streets. Vogel's operational concept was correct, and I recognized it immediately as correct. Encircle the city from the north, cut Volkov's supply lines, force the Soviet garrison to abandon Kharkov or be trapped in it. No direct assault, no house-to-house fighting. Surround, isolate, and let geography and logistics accomplish what infantry and armor would otherwise have to accomplish at enormous cost. It was the approach of a commander who understood that cities taken by encirclement cost a fraction of what cities taken by direct assault cost, and that those fractions, multiplied across enough operations, We determine whether an army remains capable of further action. I understood this. I agreed with it in the analytical part of my mind, where operational logic lived uncomplicated by other considerations. But there were factors that Vogel's plan did not weigh in the way I weighed them. The spring thaw was approaching. When the Rasputitsa came, the roads would become rivers of mud, and every vehicle on the front would be immobilized for weeks. The encirclement route to the north required additional days of movement in conditions that were already marginal. And the Soviet forces inside Kharkov, the remnants of Volkov's formations, plus the reinforcements Golikov had pushed south, were weakened, but not negligible. Given time to consolidate, they would become harder to dislodge. I communicated my intention to Hoth on the 9th of March. A direct assault from the south, with Haas leading the main effort, Reimer covering the eastern flank, and the Totenschädel executing a partial encirclement from the northwest. It was not exactly what Vogel had ordered. It was not exactly the opposite. It was a variation that combined the logic of encirclement with the directness that the timetable seemed to demand. Hoth's response was the response of a commander who prefers responsibility to fall on the subordinate. He did not approve the change explicitly. He did not prohibit it. He acknowledged my communication and noted that the operational plan was under my command authority. The responsibility was mine, as it had been in February when the decision was to withdraw. Now the decision was to attack. I want to be honest about one thing, because honesty is what distinguishes a memoir from a justification. The tactical reasons for the direct assault were real. The Rasputitsa was real. The window of opportunity was real. But there was a third factor that I acknowledged to myself privately and will acknowledge here. I wanted to retake Kharkov with the same divisions that had evacuated it. I wanted those men, the men who had moved through the dark on the 15th of February with their lights off and their engines barely audible, to be the men who drove back into the city in daylight with their armor at the front. Not to prove anything to Berlin. Not to rehabilitate my standing with a headquarters that had already decided what it thought of me, but to prove something to them, to give the withdrawal its proper meaning, that it had not been retreat for its own sake, not capitulation, not the failure that the official record would forever describe, that it had been preservation, that the thing preserved had been worth preserving, and that the proof of that was the retaking. Whether that motivation is admirable or whether it is a form of pride wearing the clothing of principle is a question I have not resolved. Both things can be true simultaneously. I know that. What I also know is that it influenced the decision, and the decision had consequences that I must account for fully. The preparations for the assault consumed the night of the 10th. The division commanders reorganized into battle groups. Mixed formations of infantry, armor, and artillery assigned axes of advance along the main roads into the city. Haas sent me an attack plan that was more a sketch of intentions than a formal staff document, which was entirely characteristic of him and which concealed beneath its apparent informality a precise understanding of the terrain and the enemy that formal documents often fail to capture. Reimer submitted a plan that was the opposite, thorough, methodical, with contingencies mapped to specific trigger conditions. Both men were ready, both divisions were warned, both would perform. I spent part of that night reviewing casualty estimates that my staff had prepared with the careful precision they always brought to numbers they wished were different. The estimates varied depending on assumptions. In the most favorable scenario, Soviet resistance would collapse quickly and losses would be moderate. In the worst, every block would be a separate battle and the cumulative cost would be severe. The intermediate estimate described the expected losses as significant, but within the expected parameters for an operation of this nature. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the distant murmur of the front. The same sound that had been the background of every night since my arrival in Ukraine. Tomorrow it would become something different. Tomorrow the Corps would advance into a city I had left 3 weeks earlier, and the cost of returning would be counted in the days that followed. I thought briefly about whether I was making the right decision, whether Vogel's encirclement would have achieved the same result with fewer dead. Then I stopped thinking about it. Questions without answers are a luxury a commander cannot afford on the eve of an attack. The assault began on the 11th of March before dawn with an artillery preparation that shook the windows of the command post 12 kilometers from the city. Not a prolonged bombardment. This lasted minutes, not days, but concentrated with a precision that compensated for its brevity. The shells fell on identified Soviet positions in the southern and western suburbs, raising columns of smoke and brick dust that mingled with the morning fog. Haas moved from the north, while his lead elements penetrated the outer suburbs in the early hours against light resistance. The Soviets had pulled back from the forward positions during the night, trading space for the tactical advantage of drawing the attacker into the dense urban terrain where armor lost its effectiveness and every building became a fortress. Raymer pushed from the west, his regiments advancing block by block with the methodical grinding efficiency that was his particular strength. The Totenschädel moved to close the northern exits, preventing Volkov's forces from withdrawing before the pressure from the south forced a decision. The first hours were deceptive in the way that the first hours of urban combat always are. The defender deliberately yields the outer positions to draw the attacker inward where the terrain favors him. That was exactly what happened from midday onward. Soviet T-34s operated from building cover in the central district, and while using the wide streets as fields of fire and withdrawing from each position before it could be flanked. Snipers fired from upper windows of buildings that had supposedly been cleared. Soviet mortars in interior courtyards, invisible from the street, protected by concrete walls, hit the advancing columns with an accuracy that suggested forward observers positioned in the buildings above them. Haas described the situation in the afternoon of the 11th as tough. From Haas, for tough meant something close to critical. He had penetrated deep into the northern sector, but was taking fire from three directions and losing men faster than the rate of advance could justify. Reimer reported that his rate of movement had dropped to hundreds of meters per hour. The second day was worse than the first. The third day was controlled punishment. The corps advancing, the Soviets yielding slowly and at cost, with the casualty figures updating every few hours in the operations room with the relentless arithmetic of attrition. On the 13th, the Totenschädel completed its movement to the northwest and cut the main road to Belgorod. Volkov was surrounded on three sides. The intelligence intercepts showed his communications within the city becoming chaotic. Units requesting ammunition and not receiving it. Units ordered to counterattack and reporting they lacked the strength to comply. With a third tank army was disintegrating from within. But disintegration does not mean cessation. The Soviet soldiers who remained in the city fought with a tenacity that did not diminish with the deterioration of their overall position. Every position taken by Haas or Reimer was taken at a price. Every building cleared cost men who would not be replaced. The casualty reports that reached me each night were columns of numbers representing specific lives. Sergeants, corporals, privates, but the occasional company officer, and the columns grew with each report. On the 14th, the resistance began to give way. Not all at once. Nothing gives way all at once in urban combat. It was a succession of local collapses that spread like fractures in glass. One sector surrendering, the adjacent sector withdrawing, another sector isolated and reduced. Haas's formations advanced more in the final 12 hours of the 14th than in the previous 3 days combined. Volkov ordered the withdrawal of what remained of his army during the night. Not everyone could get out. Entire units were trapped when the Totenschädel sealed the northern exits. But the bulk of the Soviet forces that could still move slipped eastward along secondary roads, abandoning heavy equipment in the streets. On the 15th of March 1943, Kharkov was in German hands. I received the official confirmation mid-morning, standing before the city map in the operations room, looking at the wax pencil marks that now covered every sector in blue. My operations officer read the preliminary casualty report for the SS Panzer Corps during the 4 days of urban combat. 11,500 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, across all three divisions. He delivered the number with the formula his training had given him for exactly this kind of accounting. Significant, but within the expected parameters for an operation of this nature. I received it in silence. Complete silence for longer than any officer in that room was comfortable with. 11,500. I did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate in the way that word implies. No satisfaction, no relief of the simple, uncomplicated kind, No sense of completion that could exist alongside a number like that. There was an objective achieved. There was a front stabilized. There was a core that still existed as a combat formation, a diminished and worn but coherent, capable of further action. These things were real and they mattered in the way that military outcomes matter. But beneath the maps and the reports and the figures of objectives achieved lay a foundation of dead men that no staff report could adequately represent. And beneath that, a question that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Vogel had wanted encirclement. He had been explicit. No frontal assault, no house-to-house fighting. Surround and isolate and let geography do the work. I had chosen differently. I had chosen the direct approach, driven by the calculus of time and the approaching Rasputitsa, and the assessment that the timetable demanded it, and driven by something else, the desire I had admitted to myself the night before the assault, to retake this city with these men, going this direction. If I had chosen the encirclement instead, if I had accepted the additional days, the additional uncertainty, the patience that Vogel's approach required, would the number have been different? Would it have been smaller? Would some of those 11,500 have walked out of this campaign instead of being carried out? I did not know. I would never know. That is the particular punishment of command, not the official censure, not the open account in Berlin that I knew was still waiting for me. Those are external things. They happen to you or they don't, and either way they have an end. The punishment that has no end is the question without an answer, the alternative that cannot be tested, the road not taken that may have cost less or may have cost more, and will never, under any circumstances, be available for comparison. I had made the decision. I had made it for reasons I believe were sound, and for one reason I believe was also honest. I would make it again, if the circumstances returned. Even I would spend the rest of my life not knowing whether the 11,500 had to be 11,500. That is what it means to command, not the authority, the weight. That afternoon, one of my staff officers mentioned that Belgorod would probably fall within days, extending the advance northward. Another officer noted that the Rasputitsa was approaching and that operations would need to pause soon. And they spoke with the normality of professionals already moving to the next problem before the current one was fully resolved. That is how a staff works. That is how war works. Each event is a prelude to the next. And Kharkov, both times going out and coming back, was a prelude to something larger that none of us could fully see yet. In the operational assessments arriving from Vogel's headquarters, a name was beginning to appear with increasing frequency. A place to the north and east, in where the front line had taken the shape of a bulge that both sides could see on their maps, and that both sides were already beginning to think about in terms of what would happen there when summer came. Kursk. That word would come to mean everything that Kharkov had been a preparation for. But that was the future, and the future was something I could not think about that evening. I retired to the small office in the late afternoon and sat on the cot and removed my boots. And the temperature had risen slightly, a few degrees above zero, enough for the snow to begin softening at the edges, enough for the mud to appear in the low places where the melt collected first. The Rasputitsa would come within days. The roads would turn to swamp. Vehicles would be immobilized. Operations would halt for weeks, and both sides would use the pause to rebuild what the winter had consumed. And when the ground hardened again in summer, everything would begin again. And I sat on the cot with my boots on the floor and my overcoat still on, and looked at the wall of the office without seeing it. I thought about the question I had been circling since February. The question that had been present in that cold room on the night of the 14th, when I sat alone with the lamp turned low and decided to disobey. When the orders are wrong, when compliance means destruction. When the silence of obedience is indistinguishable from the silence of the grave. What does a soldier owe the men he commands, and what does he owe the system that commands him? I had answered that question in February. 20,000 men were alive because I had answered it the way I answered it. That was not nothing. In the specific arithmetic of that winter, it was everything. And yet the answer had cost 11,500 in March. And I could not say with certainty that a different answer in February would not have cost fewer in March. The two decisions were connected in ways that could not be separated, and the full accounting of what they had produced together was still being written in the movements of men and armies across a front that stretched from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The account in Berlin was still open. Stern was gone. Kroll was dead before justice could reach him. Falk was somewhere in Germany. The war finished for him in a way that left no clean ending. Hass was already thinking about the next problem, which was his particular form of sanity. Reimer was writing reports with the precision of a man who believes that documentation is a form of order in a world that is otherwise without it. And I was sitting on a cot in a borrowed office in a city I had abandoned and retaken, holding a question that had no clean answer, which is the condition of every decision made under impossible circumstances by fallible men in possession of incomplete information. Outside, Kharkov smoldered in the quiet of a Ukrainian afternoon in March. The snow was melting. The mud was beginning to show through in the low places. In a few days it would be everywhere, turning every road into a river, stopping every vehicle, pausing the war in the particular way that the steppe pauses everything, not ending it, not resolving it, and only suspending it until the ground is hard enough again to carry the weight of what is coming. I put my boots back on. There were reports to review. There were men who needed orders. There was a front that still existed, and a corps that could still fight, and a map that was already being marked with positions and arrows that pointed toward the next thing, and the thing after that, and the thing after that. The war does not ask whether you have finished with the last decision before it presents you with the next one. It only presents the next one and waits, and the waiting is always shorter than you need it to be. I stood up. I put on my coat. I went back to the maps. That is what soldiers do. That is what they have always done. They absorb what has happened, they carry what cannot be set down, and they go back to the maps. Outside, Kharkov smoldered in silence. The snow was melting. And somewhere in the east, across the frozen fields and the broken roads and the long, white emptiness of the Ukrainian steppe, the spring was coming, bringing with it everything that spring in a year of war always brings: the mud, the waiting. And then, when the ground was ready, the next battle. The Rasputitsa came as promised. Within days of Kharkov's fall, the temperature rose above zero, and the Ukrainian steppe, which had been frozen solid since November, began the transformation that soldiers on the Eastern Front dreaded more than almost any enemy action. The frost came out of the ground. The roads, which had been hard as iron, turned into channels of mud that swallowed vehicles whole, not dramatically, not in the sudden catastrophic way that combat destroys machines, but slowly and thoroughly, with the patient inevitability of the earth reclaiming what had been lent to it. A tank that had rolled across frozen ground at 40 kilometers an hour could, within the same kilometer, sink to its hull in mud and require hours of work by its entire crew to extract. The operational pause was total. Both sides stopped. There was nothing else to do. The front, which had been in violent motion since January, simply ceased to move, and the men who had been fighting and dying and retreating and advancing for 4 months were left standing in mud up to their boot tops, now looking at each other across the distances that the weather had made impassable, waiting for the ground to harden. I used the time to do the things that continuous operations had made impossible. The divisions were reorganized. Equipment was repaired or replaced. The casualty lists from the winter campaign were compiled and verified, which was work that took days and produced documents that I read slowly, name by name, allowing each name to register before moving to the next. This was a practice I had maintained since early in the war. The deliberate reading of casualties not as aggregate figures, but as individuals. And it was a practice that had become harder with each campaign, not easier, because each campaign produced more names than the one before it. The 11,500 from the Kharkov assault. The losses from the winter defensive fighting before the withdrawal. The men left behind when we evacuated the city on the night of the 15th. The wounded in the aid stations. The rearguard elements that had been too heavily engaged to disengage. The companies that had not received the order in time. I did not know all of their names, and the ones I did not know were in some ways the heaviest burden, because nameless losses have a way of becoming abstract that name losses do not. I submitted the reports that the chain of command required. I received the communications that the chain of command sent back. Routine operational traffic, supply requests, personnel queries, the administrative machinery of an army that continued to function regardless of what had happened in February and March. No one mentioned the withdrawal from Kharkov in any of these communications. No one mentioned the disobeyed order. And the silence that Berlin had established was maintained through the pause, with the same consistency it had been maintained since the withdrawal, which told me that the situation had not been resolved but only suspended, and that the resolution would come at a time and in a form of Berlin's choosing rather than mine. I found during those weeks of mud and waiting that the thing I thought about most was not the decision of February 14th. I had made that decision, and it was made, and the making of it was complete in a way that left no useful room for further examination. What I thought about was the men who had executed it, the soldiers and the sergeants and the junior officers who had moved through the dark on the roads to Krasnograd, not knowing whether the withdrawal was authorized, not knowing whether their corps commander was about to be arrested, in not knowing anything except that the order to move had come down through the chain of command in the proper form and that they would follow it. Their trust in the chain of command was the same trust I had violated the chain of command in order to honor. There was a paradox in that which I recognized and could not resolve. A soldier follows orders. That is the foundation of everything an army is. Without that foundation, no coordinated action is possible, no plan can be executed, no battle can be fought. The entire institution rests on the willingness of men at every level to do what they are told, trusting that the men above them have the information and the judgment to give orders that are worth following. I had given an order worth following on the night of the 14th. I had been certain of that at the time, and I remain certain of it. But I had violated the principle that made my order possible, the principle that orders come from above and are executed below, that the chain is unbroken, that the authority of command derives from its consistency and not from the wisdom of any individual commander. I had broken the chain, and the chain had held anyway, because the men below me had trusted it regardless of what was happening at the top. That was the thing I could not quite settle, not the decision itself, the debt it created. The men who had trusted me had been right to trust me, and the system I had violated had been wrong in what it demanded. And both of those things were true, and they did not add up to a clean conclusion. Haas came to see me once more during the pause, on an afternoon of pale March sunlight that lit the mud in a way that was almost beautiful if you were not looking at it from inside a vehicle trying to move through it. He arrived on foot. When having left his vehicle on the road where the mud became impassable, and he sat across from me with the mud still on his boots and the sun through the window behind him, and told me that his men were ready, that the winter had done what winters do, but that the Leibgard was intact, that they had done what was asked of them and were prepared to do what would be asked next. I thanked him. And he looked at me for a moment in the way that Haas always looked at you when there was something he had decided to say and was deciding how to say it. Then he said that in his opinion, and he recognized that his opinion had not been solicited, the decision in February had been the right decision, and that the men knew it, and that the knowing of it mattered to them in the way that soldiers need the decisions made above them to make sense. They did not require the decisions to be safe, he said. They required them to be honest. I did not know what to say to that. Haas did not wait for a response. He stood up, put his cap on, and left. The mud on his boots left marks across the floor of the office that his men had cleaned and organized with the attention to detail that soldiers bring to the spaces their commanders occupy. And I looked at those mud marks for a while after he left, thinking about what honesty costs in a war and whether the costs had been distributed fairly. And they had not been distributed fairly. They never are. The 11,500 had paid a cost that I had not paid. Stern had paid a cost that I had avoided. Kroll had paid a cost that was not the one he deserved, and the one he deserved had never been presented. Falk had paid a cost in the particular currency of a broken mind that no one who had not experienced it could fully value. And I had paid the cost that I had paid. The open account in Berlin, the mark on the record, on the question I would carry for the rest of my life. And it was not nothing, but it was not 11,500 either. The ground hardened in late April. The plans that had been forming in the operational assessments during the pause began to take concrete shape. Kursk. The bulge in the front that both sides could see. The place where the summer of 1943 would be decided in ways that none of us, standing in the aftermath of a winter that had already changed everything, who could yet fully anticipate. The Leibgard, das Schwert, the Totenschädel under its new permanent commander, the same corps that had withdrawn from Kharkov in the dark and retaken it in daylight, would be among the formations that drove toward Kursk when the summer came. That is another story. It would not be told by a man sitting on a cot in a borrowed office in March with his boots on the floor. It would be told by the same man standing before a different map in a different season with the same questions that do not resolve and the same obligation to go back to the maps regardless. I stood up. I put on my boots. I went back to the maps. Outside, Kharkov smoldered in the quiet of a March afternoon, and the spring was coming, and with it everything that spring in a year of war always brings. The mud first, then the waiting, then the hardening of the ground, and then the resumption of all the things that the cold had only paused and never stopped. The question I had asked myself on the night of February 14th, when the orders are wrong, when obedience means destruction, what does a soldier choose, had been answered. The answer had kept 20,000 men alive. The answer had cost 11,500 in the retaking. The answer had left Stern without a command, and Kroll without a reckoning, and Falk without a proper ending, and a mark in a ledger in Berlin that was still open. Every answer to that question carries its full accounting with it. There is no answer that is clean. There is only the answer you give, and the weight you carry afterward, and the maps that keep presenting the next question before you have finished with the last. I went back to the maps. That is what soldiers do.